sometimes the mature global corporation can be a little bit of a beacon, because they've been subject to democratic, open pressure, back home, and they've had to clean up their act. So it is interesting that, the local government, which may or may not be super corrupt on this front, or certainly the local private firms, might not be reliable leaders on this front. It has to be, I think, contingent on, the specifics of the region. But, you pick whoever is willing to to take that seriously. And it can vary. But a great question.
No. Hello. My name is Tazeen Hassan with the Gender Anchor. And I had two questions. One for Sylvia, which was on the question of, at the moment, all the perks and benefits that are given in India and China to women are as a result of limited labor force supply. But as that increases, how do you embed those advantages and plus points into private sector behavior, and whether it needs regulation at the end of the day? And I had a second question, which was more kind of general, which was how, and I think maybe Louise and Namita can help on that. It was how women's networks can either reinforce occupational segregation or help break occupational segregation.
Again, great question. I think the demographic shifts are creating an ongoing talent famine in at least some major markets. Think China, right? Mm-hmm. Getting very top-heavy. Mm-hmm. India less so because of the demographic dividend, still being played out. So it does vary from country to country. But all of these nations are dealing with much smaller family sizes, so that, India will also be running out of young workers in, 30 years' time. But to the second part of your question, I do feel that it has to be taken up by government, and there has to be a megaphone provided by government. For instance, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil has been wonderful at taking some of the best private sector initiatives, particularly around safety, and giving it a whole bully pulpit right across Brazil. So that everyone knows that this is what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be keeping your female talent safe so they can actually go to work. So I'm not discounting at all the symbiosis, if you like, between the enlightened private sector company and government in terms of seeing this as vitally important.
There have been two questions so far on regulation, so I wanted to actually speak to both of them. And so, first of all, I grew up in the era in which labor law almost never protected women in the U.S. And so I guess coming out of that experience, that it effectively protected primarily pale males, to be specific. And I come out of that era with somewhat of a jaundiced view, shall we say, non-pale at least, view of labor laws in general. And then I did a paper that looked about whether labor laws were important or unimportant in deterring employment in manufacturing firms in sub-Saharan Africa, and I came up with the view that they weren't really important, in part because although they vary substantially, the enforcement is fairly weak. And so I guess I would say, women of the world, if we're looking for labor laws and labor legislation and their enforcement to protect women, maybe we're in trouble. It's not that I think the law law is a teacher. It embodies certain norms. It's good to have a constitution that offers protection of various rights and a discussion about that. But I think self-help groups, collective action are also important, and I think female networks also can be important. And I think the real issue often is there space within the political system, within the government? Is there space for that voice to happen? And what I think is quite interesting is the role of decentralization in creating more space in sub-Saharan Africa for that voice. I think, although it's not necessarily decentralization that creates space, but there's no question that, for example, maids, a group of women that in general tends to have suffer from a number of workplace issues. Collective action supported by outside NGOs, within country NGOs, this has been extremely important. And I think, the ILO has come very late to that game. That structure about labor laws and labor regulations and unions and government, it may not do the trick.
Yeah. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this whole issue of limited labor supply. So Jeni mentioned this whole initiative that we launched, WinWest, where what we tried to do, because one thing which was very clear to us was that if you have to talk about gender-inclusive policies to the private sector, you've really got to talk the language of bottom line. You've got to build a business case for the private sector to do the right thing. So one of the examples, one of the case studies we saw was, in areas which are typically male-dominated, in sectors where you hardly ever see a woman, like mining, like construction, like engineering, these large companies, what is the business case for them to employ women? And the business case for them usually is very much trying to make use of the entire labor force, the talent pool. So this particular Brazilian company that we studied, they had to set up a hydroelectric plant in the northwestern part of Brazil. And for workforce stability, they really wanted to hire from the local labor force. But it was clear to them that if it would be very inefficient to ignore half the area's population. So they had to employ women. But it was also clear to them that women would not have the skills to apply for a lot of the jobs. So what they did was they put out this free pre-hire training program. It was, of course, open for men and women, but given that women would typically have not had the skills to apply for those jobs, a large number of women enrolled in that training program. And lo and behold, 10% of the company's labor force was very quickly women. So when you talk to that company and say, why would you put out a free training program for pre-hires? They said, well, we frankly didn't do it as a social program. We did it because there was a business case. The investment to savings ratio for that company was 9:1. And they rolled out this training program in other regions as well. But the benefit to them was they were able to attract a number of women. They were able to attract a number of women from the local labor force, which was cheaper. And a number of them now reflect on their experience and say, actually, it turned out to be a pretty good thing because our work atmosphere became more respectful. They saw they saw a decrease in absenteeism, decrease in staff turnover rates. So there was a strong business case. But the beginning of it was the fact that they had to deal with this issue of limited labor force. But very quickly on networks, I just wanted to say, in AFRCE, we're also working with something called the Global Banking Alliance for Women, especially to mobilize the importance of networks. And the way it began was just 4 banks that worked in Canada, Sweden, and I can't remember, but basically developed countries that came together and said, we have issues in dealing with the women-owned segment of our market, so they formed an alliance. And now a lot of banks from the developing world are also joining this alliance, and there's huge demand for it because they're learning from each other, and so networking is absolutely essential.
I have one question for Namita and Sylvia. My name is Matt Morton. I'm with PRMGE, and one for Louise as well. For Namita and Sylvia, you make a really compelling case on the constraints that are facing women, and they're varied and they're multiple for entering the labor force, and also really good examples of where the private sector has stepped up and done things that are positive to break those barriers. I guess I have a basic question. Firms are listening to this via webcast or whatever. How do they take the first step? Do they have the diagnostic tools that are available to them because the constraints are so varied? How do they know where to begin? How do they know when to handle the problem by elderly care versus child care or what have you? And just wondering if you think that firms have the diagnostic tools available to them to take those first steps, or how they should begin. And for Louise, was wondering about, I thought your point about the government not always being the best vehicle to take on, say, training programs or to implement them well is a really important point. I've seen that as well. However, it presents challenges for scaling up interventions that work, and wondering how we cross that bridge when we find something that's innovative and at least efficacious at the NGO level. How then do we take it to scale if we can't rely on the public sector to do it?
Just two quick responses, Matt. First off, the big challenge for private sector employers in the markets I've been looking at is retaining and accelerating women. It's not recruiting them in the first place because they're turning up in droves for these jobs. And as I was explaining, they are very good candidates at the entry level. And one thing that we've been working on with this flood of work, and there are now 7 studies we've done on this, is precisely showing how to retain and fully realize this talent pool. And just copying practices in the West doesn't work. You are facing very different opportunities as well as constraints in these markets. So if you're Carrefour or E&Y, you have to be tremendously nuanced, because just importing what worked in France or North America will backfire. The other thing I just want to underscore, and it's kind of a bottom line, I think, from today, is that female leadership matters. I'll give you 2 examples. The only large economy right now which is driving the income distribution in a progressive fashion is Brazil. It is headed up by a woman. She has a huge value placed on the welfare of the bottom 50%. And it is the only nation going against the global trend of increased polarization. And one of her inspiring, guiding principles is that she wants, the women and children of Brazil to disproportionately benefit from her years in office. Now, she didn't start from scratch. Lula obviously put this in place, but it is remarkable. The second thing is that the IMF, in its analysis, its internal analysis of what went wrong in the 2008 crisis, why they missed calling that, and failed in their mission to mitigate global risk. So in their internal analysis, which has recently been published, right, they say that the problem was homogeneity at the top. There was an echo chamber, 23 people, all pale males, who had gone collectively to 5 graduate schools, could not conceive that the system was at risk. And they said it was groupthink and intellectual capture. This was the internal report. So this business of having women at the top is not just nice for those women, right? It is powerful for the direction of nations.
So just quickly on that question that Matt raised, how do firms know where to begin? Do they have the diagnostic tools? In a number of cases, which is why I'm a great believer in having the right laws. Because in a number of cases, companies begin to take that action just to be compliant, because the cost of being non-compliant is just so high. But what we are finding in some of the leading companies is that they're going beyond compliance because they see a business case. But usually, the first step is compliance. In a Kenyan company that we worked with, they had a huge social audit in 2004, which told them that things weren't right. So they had to swing into action simply because they had to keep their European market share. They were supplying flowers to Europe. So that was the wake-up call for them. But they had exactly the question that you raised. Where do we start? What is it that we can do? Do we have the diagnostic tools? They didn't. So one of the things, and I think this would be true for a large number of companies, that you don't know where to begin. So one of the things they did was to create something called gender committees. What it was basically committees that allowed men and women, both, to meet regularly, to air their concerns, voice their issues in an open, safe atmosphere, and had to be sort of mediated well. You have to do that well, to really understand what is it that we can do to make this a more family-friendly place to work in. So women brought up issues like, can we take a break because we need to be breastfeeding? These are issues which the company had, just never thought of. Or that there were these subtle cases of, not so subtle in some cases, of course, but of sexual harassment. So a lot of times I think it's not a science, it's an art, that you've got to listen to your employees. You've got to look at your own specific context that you're working in and figure out where you go from there. I don't think it's a science that you would do everywhere. So I think the diagnostics is very much has to be customized.
This is such an interesting discussion. By the way, I might note that the two women at the top both went to one of those 5 same grad schools, but at the IMF. But nonetheless, I'm inspired by their internal analysis and the women at the top. So that's great. I think in terms of what government could do. Okay, so first of all, government should be providing public goods, infrastructure. So that when people come out of these programs, they can actually be productive. And infrastructure to increase women's productivity in household chores also. That's one of the things that water supply does. That's one of the things that effective healthcare does. I think then I think government can perhaps provide some of these. This is an area where nudges might work. Now, behavioral economics suggests to us that the same nudge that works in one country won't work in another country. So the fact that soap operas are getting women to think differently in India doesn't necessarily mean they'll work in Nigeria or Kenya or whatever. But I do think those are things where government can put more visibility on women that are doing different things to sort of affect some of the norms and get those norms working. The curriculum in the schools is clearly not getting people ready for the world of work. I think when you're talking about only 15% are ready from university, a part of that is that they're not learning the fundamental skills that they need, cognitive and higher level skills, reasoning skills that they need. But another is their soft skills and some of these, and I think that's another thing that the curriculums could address. What is the job market you're likely to be going into? What do different things pay? What do different people do in their work? What we call career education simply doesn't happen in many parts of the developing world. There's an argument for some demand-driven financing, and some of that's worked. I heard earlier today at the opening session, Jaime Savendra say, we've really got to regulate some of these informal suppliers of apprenticeships and training and whatever, because a lot of them don't teach much. Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of other things that government maybe could regulate first, but some demand-driven, some information where people who are some of these informal trainers can provide, can register, say, with a workforce authority like they're having them do in Rwanda, and then provide information on what people are doing afterwards, and then they qualify for some demand-driven financing. These are kind of interesting ways which could possibly work to scale some of these things up.
Okay, great. Thanks, Louise and Sylvia and Namita. I think it's been a great conversation. We'll put together some kind of summary and circulate that. It's difficult now to put together all of the key takeaways that emerge, but let me just try and highlight some of the main messages that came across. I think there was an important element of good news, which I think is important to bear in mind. The way in which tertiary educated women are thriving in middle income countries, I think is something to be noted, and something from which I think we can learn. I was actually reminded that my husband, who's a professor at Georgetown, was noting that something like 3/4 of the students getting prizes last Friday at Georgetown were women, girls. They're doing just much better academically. So I guess it's could be a global phenomenon. And the importance of scarcity and the way in which that's leading to innovation, but also that we need to bear in mind that oftentimes it's going to be quite context specific. The pervasiveness of constraints, I think, came across very importantly as well. And I think that at the other end of the market, kind of either the lack of education, that there are still, I think, 35 million primary aged girls out of school, very serious quality issues at the lower levels are a major challenge. The importance of sexual harassment in its different shapes and forms, as well as the generic systemic problems around a poor investment climate, which includes weak infrastructure, lack of access to finance, and so on. But I think that the promising avenues that we heard about in terms of kind of competition and the possibility of a race to the top, and the way in which that can have demonstration effects, I think, is something that we need to keep close track on. The discovery of new market segments and the way in which that's playing out among AFRCE clients, I think, is important. And I think the other interesting side of the story was about changing norms over time, and changing norms kind of within families and reaching out to families, the stories that Sylvia told at the community level, the roles that NGOs, I think, can play as well, is very important. So I think it's been a great session. I think that there are various kind of avenues for follow-up for us. I think great insights for the report that we're working on. Thanks to Matt for putting this together, and we'll publicise what came out. But thanks again for your participation. And to the panel.